Dr. M V Ramana is a physicist at the Nuclear Futures Laboratory, Princeton University. And besides authoring numerous technical papers on the subject of nuclear power, Dr. Ramana is also known as an eloquent and articulate speaker on the geopolitics of nuclear energy and its changing prospects over the years. In late 2012, Penguin India has published his first solo book, which is called The Power of Promise. He's currently in Chennai as part of a multi-city tour of India to discuss and release his book. Good afternoon, Dr. Ramana, and thank you very much for being with us here at the Asian. So, your book has a very interesting title, The Power of Promise. And in Tamil Nadu, we're painfully aware of the undelivered promise of power, specifically electricity. What is the point that you're trying to make by this title that you've chosen?
The title came after I wrote the book, and as I was studying the history of nuclear energy in India. And what I saw was that over the course of the last several decades, when nuclear power has been established in the country since the inception of the Department of Atomic Energy, the nuclear establishment has made a number of promises of how important nuclear power is going to be as a source of electricity generation in the country in the future. And these projections have always been for the future, and they have never been delivered as such. But by making this promise that in the future there's going to be a large amount of power, they ensure that the Department of Atomic Energy and all the nuclear activities it conducts are supported by the political leadership as well as the elite in the country. And this is also combined with yet another promise. So the promise here is of two natures. One is of large amounts of energy in the future, but also of perfect security through the building of nuclear weapons. And the Department of Atomic Energy is unique in being a technology that offers these two different promises, these two different aspirations that the elite have. One of being able to consume large amounts of energy, which they feel is necessary for development and economic growth, and of weapons of nuclear weapons, which they feel was going to provide them with security. So in that sense, nuclear power forms a technology that offers the capacity for mass production, mass consumption, and mass destruction, and that seems very, very unique. And what I find is that the nuclear establishment gets its political power through these promises.
One of the important kind of methods by which the nuclear establishment has tried to get its buy-in to this project, to this whole program, has been its much touted three-stage program. And your book suggests that this has been and will remain a non-starter. Can you tell us more about what this three-stage program is and why you think so? Why you think that it's going to be a non-starter?
Before I say, I would say I don't think it's a non-starter. It's already started, but it's going to be a non-deliverer. The three-stage program was first enunciated by the Department of Atomic Energy, in particular its founder, a physicist called Homi Bhabha. The first time that he talked about this in 1954. And this was in the context of a debate in Parliament with a critique of the nuclear establishment as it had been set up at that point, a chap called Meghnad Saha, who was a very well-known physicist. And Bhabha basically used the idea that India has a large amount of thorium, and he wanted to try and use that thorium to try and make the nuclear power. And the reason he wanted to do that has to do with this question of promise. So let me start by explaining what the basic issue is. So if you wanted to generate large amounts of nuclear power in the country, then you needed large amounts of uranium. And at that time, and subsequently too, what it seems is the case with India and Indian geology in particular, is that we have a fairly limited amount of uranium, and the uranium is not of particularly good quality. And to qualify that, let me also point out, when I mean limited amount of uranium that's of high enough quality that it's economical to mine it. uranium is very plentiful. You can find it in your backyard, but the amount of uranium that you will find by sort of sifting through your entire backyard will probably be a few grams. So it's not worth it. But if you want to look for somewhat good quality ore, then the amounts are fairly limited in India. Now, nuclear energy is to be a big source of power, and that too you want to do it in such a way that it only depends on indigenous resources, then you could not depend on this uranium, as it were. It so happens that India also has a large amount of thorium, and around the world at that time, people in nuclear establishments in many different parts of the world, France for example, all felt that they had limited amounts of uranium and they had to find ways of exploiting this thorium, which is typically more abundantly found around the world. And as a way to do that, they set up a 3-stage program. In the first stage, what you would do is to use natural uranium that you find in nature in the cores of what are called heavy water reactors. So these are reactors where the neutrons are slowed down through interaction with water, where there is a heavier isotope of hydrogen called deuterium which is present. And that deuterium slows down the neutrons so efficiently, then the neutrons have a much higher probability of hitting another nucleus of uranium, causing them to fission. So that's the first stage of reactors. The next stage was that you would take the spent fuel, that's the fuel that is being irradiated inside a nuclear reactor, during the course of which the uranium that's initially in the fuel would have got converted into plutonium. So you would take this spent fuel, after you cool it for a while, you process it in a reprocessing plant. It's basically a chemical plant where you would dissolve it in acid and so on, add various chemicals to try and separate out the plutonium. The plutonium in turn in the second phase would be used to fuel a reactor, which is called a breeder reactor. A breeder reactor is one where the core has this plutonium, which is actually the one which is fissioning, and then is surrounded by a blanket of other uranium or thorium, which in turn would absorb some of the neutrons that are escaping from the core of the reactor to be converted into plutonium if it's uranium, or uranium-233, a different isotope if it's thorium. And in turn, if you produce enough uranium-233, you could start thinking about reactors where you had uranium-233 in the core and you had thorium blankets. So this 3-stage idea that Bhabha had. The problem with this idea is essentially the second stage. The second stage involves these so-called breeder reactors, and these breeder reactors, because of the fact that you're using this highly fissile plutonium in a very dense configuration, you produce a huge amount of heat in a very small volume. And this requires the use of metals, molten metals, to conduct this heat out of the reactor. You cannot use water. And this has been a huge source of problems for breeder reactors around the world. The other set of problems are that breeder reactors are susceptible to certain kinds of very catastrophic accidents. All of these typically conspire to make breeder reactors very expensive. And as a result of this, many countries which initially thought much about breeder reactors have abandoned this idea. So this includes the United States, includes the United Kingdom, France. So as of now, it's mostly India and Russia, and to a small extent China, which is interested in this. If you get through this whole stage, then you have to get to the thorium stage. And thorium has all the problems of the second stage of uranium and other problems, which have to do with the fact that when you produce uranium-233, it comes with a contaminant, which is uranium-232, which is highly radioactive. So even to make that substance into fuel rods, you would have to do it remotely behind concrete walls and things of that sort, which make the process very expensive. So thorium is, I would expect, to be much more expensive than even the breeder reactors that are there today.
But we do have a breeder reactor in Kalpakkam coming up.
We do have it, yes, and I'm talking about
Okay, we'll come to that in a bit. Now, authoritative sources, including the likes of the Prime Minister, have suggested that India will get nearly 275 gigawatts of electricity through nuclear power by 2052. And we've seen numerous news reports that just reproduce this without any critical insight into how achievable this is. What are your thoughts on this, and what do you say about it in the book?
These kind of goals, as I've said, have been enunciated many times in the past and never been achieved. The 275,000 megawatts by 2052 came around in the early 2000s, And actually in more recent years it's been revised even upwards to 470,000. I've seen figures as of that. Apart from all the other problems of nuclear power that it has, long reactor construction times, expensive, all that kind of all those issues that are familiar, there's a special problem with this particular projection. This particular projection is based on building large numbers of breeder reactors. These breeder reactors, I've told you, have other problems, but even if you set aside all those problems and you assume that you have the money to put into this and so on, there is a problem with this projection which has to do with the accounting for the plutonium that is required. So, as I mentioned earlier, breeder reactors are ones where if you put in a certain amount of plutonium, it could generate more plutonium at the end of the cycle. But in order to get that plutonium out, you have to do various things. So you would have to take the spent fuel out of the reactor, you have to wait for it to cool, you have to reprocess it in a reprocessing plant, then you have to take the plutonium out, make it into fuel rods, rebuild another reactor core with it, and then start that reactor. All of those things take a certain amount of time. And in the case of the DAE's projections, they have just not allotted enough time for that. So this is not a matter of being optimistic or pessimistic, it's a matter of physics. And in mathematical terms, for those people who understand mathematics, the difference is between having what's called a differential equation and what's called a difference equation. And the DAE's thing is inaccurate because it just assumes that the growth will be sort of smooth and exponential, whereas you have to take into account all these discrete actions which have to be done. Once you put into, and if you go by the DAE's projections, you would actually end up very soon, within about 5 to 10 years, with negative amounts of plutonium. Because you need the plutonium to fuel the reactor and so on. There's just not enough plutonium for that. If you do try to be careful about your plutonium accounting and not assume that you can produce it out of thin air, then what happens is that these projections are automatically down by about 40 to 60%. And if you try to take into account more realistic projections, then you'll probably come down to about 80% of what they have. So even in the theoretical level, you're not going to be able to reach the kind of 275,000 or 470,000 numbers that you were talking about.
And that figure you're saying assumes that the second and third stage would be able to go up
smoothly. This is all only second stage.
Only second stage.
Yeah, thorium, even the Department of Atomic Energy's plans comes about only after 2052. I'd also say one more thing about thorium since you've talked about it. Which is that there used to be a joke in the electronics industry. The electronics industry, as you know, is mostly based on silicon. And in the 80s, they used to talk about germanium as being the ideal metal for semiconductors and all kinds of chips and so on. But germanium was found to have various problems. So by the 80s and 90s, people used to make this joke about germanium, saying germanium is the material of the future, always has been, always will be. And I think thorium is very much like that. It's this magic grail that they want to have it. It's always in the future and always will remain in the future.
Your book meticulously highlights the various mishaps and hurdles faced during the construction and commissioning of various reactors. In one instance, you mention a fire and an explosion preceded and closely followed the Prime Minister's visit to Kalpakkam when Indira Gandhi went there to dedicate the MAPS-1 reactor to the nation. Was this incident widely reported? Do these mishaps, which are euphemistically called incidents, come to light automatically and immediately?
Usually not. In some cases they do come about. I think, I do not know actually whether this was widely reported at that point. I found out about it actually through the writings of a retired DAE secretary, M R Srinivasan. In his autobiography, he had talked about this. That's how I found out about it. What typically happens in many of these cases is that immediately after the event, you often do not find anything in the public medium. Occasionally, some workers leak news of these kinds of things to the media and so on. That's how you find out about it. You find out some mishaps through the annual reports of the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board and things of that sort. So you find some information. It's not, the picture is neither completely dark or completely transparent. It's somewhat mixed. And so you do find out some details, but sometimes not.
You're now in Chennai, a metropolis less than 100 kilometers from Kalpakkam. And on the other side of Kalpakkam sits Pondicherry, another teeming town. NPCL claims, I mean, I know that in one of its the 25th year, it claimed that the Kalpakkam plants have operated without any hazard for several reactor years. How true is this? What are the kinds of facilities that are currently running in Kalpakkam? Is there any cause for concern for people who are living in Chennai or in Pondicherry?
I would answer this at three levels. The first level is asking just what we know. So in terms of empirical things, there have been a number of small incidents of the kind that you mentioned, various, heavy water leaks, things tripping and so on and so forth. Now, if you think about all these things as some kind of an indicator of the health of the system, it's sort of like saying there's a man who's going around, or a woman for that matter, who's going around who has occasional shortness of breath, who's not able to climb stairs, who has some occasionally slight chest pain and things of that sort. He or she may not have had a heart attack at that point, but clearly the signs are not good. Another thing to sort of look at this whole picture is to say, look at the experience so far, and can you decide that because you've not had any major accidents, catastrophic accidents, that the system is safe? And again, the answer is no, because the number of years of experience is very, very limited compared to the accuracy and the confidence that you want to have about how few accidents there are. So to give an example, if you see the discussions about Kudakulam or any of these reactors, they would often say things like, we have done our analysis of this and the probability of a core damage accident in this would be 10 to the minus 6 per reactor year, 10 to the minus 7 or something like that. Really small numbers, 1 part in a million, 1 part in 10 million and so on and so forth. If you wanted to get that kind of a figure from empirical data, you would have to have tens and hundreds of thousands of years of reactor year experience without any accidents to say, well, this is reasonable, right? In the absence of that kind of experience, you can say, you cannot be sure of this number with any great confidence. Finally, I would say the most concern about the kind of facilities that we are building in Kalpakkam are twofold. One is this breeder reactor that they're constructing, called the prototype fast breeder reactor. It's the first reactor, commercial scale reactor of the second stage of the phase program. It's a 500 megawatt reactor fueled by plutonium with liquid sodium, removing the heat from the core. And this has various problems with its design. In particular, it has something called a positive void coefficient, which is very dangerous, which is what actually happened, which led to the accident in Chernobyl. The reactor has a certain kind of behavior which is not stable. And this reactor, the prototype fast breeder reactor, has been built with a containment, which is the big structure that you see from far in any reactor, which is not of adequate strength in order to contain the accident if one should happen, a really worst case accident. So that's one area where I would be very concerned about the Kalpakkam reactor. The second is the reprocessing plant, which also is in Kalpakkam, where the spent fuel is chopped up and dissolved in acid and plutonium extracted. When this process is done, one should remember that all the radioactivity that's sitting inside the spent fuel, none of it goes away, because that's a physical property that cannot destroy radioactivity. So what happens is all this radioactivity gets stored in the form of what are called high-level waste, which are extremely concentrated sources of radioactivity. They're usually held and kept in steel tanks. Ideally, one would like to see this liquid actually blended with some kind of glass to form something called vitrified paste. In Kalpakkam, for whatever reason, I don't know why, they haven't managed to get the vitrification plant to work. All the new annual reports of the Department of Atomic Energy talk about them building a vitrification plant, and they always say work is progressing, it is expected to be completed, but I've never seen one which says it is completed as of about a year or so ago. So my sense is that even if the plant has started operating, they probably have a huge backlog of high-level waste. And this is something which, if cooling fails for some reason, can actually explode due to chemical reactions, which is in principle possible. And this kind of an explosion has happened in 1957 at the Mayak reprocessing plant in the Soviet Union, which contaminated a huge area of land. So those are the kinds of things which I would be very worried about.
cheap, the nuclear electricity is cheap. What do your studies suggest and conclude about this suggestion?
This claim about nuclear power being cheap has been made in sort of two ways. One is when the early days of nuclear power, they talked about it being too cheap to meter, that it is so cheap that you don't even have to cost it and so on. Those kinds of claims have largely vanished. In fact, The Economist magazine said nuclear power has changed from being too cheap to meter to too expensive to matter. So it's something of that sort. But now if you look at the other way by which they talk about is when nuclear power is compared with another source of energy, and the argument is made that it's cheaper than that. So in India, the primary source of energy has electricity generation in the country has been coal, and nuclear power has been consistently compared to that. So in the early years, what they quickly realized was that nuclear power can't compete directly with coal. So the strategy was to say, well, near the coal mines, we will not be able to certainly compete, but as you go further and further away from where most of the coal is mined, then you have to include the cost of transporting coal to that thing. And the assumption is, okay, once you go sufficiently far away, then nuclear power is going to become cheaper. So there would at least be some parts of the country where it makes sense, economic sense to have nuclear power because the cost of delivering coal and therefore generating electricity from that would be too high. So in the early years, they would talk about in the 50s and 60s, they were talking about 600 kilometers as the distance, 500 to 600 kilometers. And so once you go beyond that, then nuclear power would be cheaper. But this was before any reactors had actually been built. Once the first set of reactors had been built and their costs sort of understood, what happened was you found this is not going to happen. So by the 1980s, as the first reactors happened, they talked about it being 800 kilometers away. Once it was 800 kilometers away, then it would compete. But then they were very confident at that time, and they said, oh, by the 1990s, we would have lowered the cost of nuclear power plants so that it's going to compete even at the pit head, where the coal is mined. Now, come the 1990s, all they could say was you go to 1200 kilometers, and then maybe it's going to be competitive. Now, this is roughly the period when I started looking into nuclear power, and in the early 2000s, I did a costing of comparing electricity being generated at the Kaiga nuclear power plant with a coal plant that had been recently constructed at that point, and at Raichur. Now, the other thing which you found in all these studies of economics was that they would never use costs of real nuclear power plants or real coal plants. It would be some arbitrary figure, 5 crores per megawatt, 3 crores per megawatt, which you sort of just pull out of a hat and say this is the cost of we would assume this to be the cost of a nuclear power plant. So we said no, we would like to do it empirically, and we looked at the Kaiga plant and the Raichur plant. We assumed for the Raichur plant the coal comes from 1400 kilometers away, so more than the 1200 kilometers, and you still found that nuclear power was more expensive for realistic discount rates. The other claim that you see all the time is that in the nuclear power so far has not been cheaper, but in the future it is going to be cheaper because we are going to decrease the cost of building these nuclear power plants. Again, experience around the world suggests that this is not the case. In both the United States and France, which have had the most experience building nuclear power plants, costs have actually increased over a period of time. And this is primarily because they've had to incorporate more and more safety features into nuclear reactors in part, and in part because everything else has become more and more expensive. So on the whole, I would say the claim that nuclear power is cheap is just not been found to be true.
Now, this you're not even going to the aspects about waste management and cost of a catastrophic event.
That's right. And also in this so-called breeder reactors, which tend to be even more expensive than ordinary reactors.
So why is it that if nuclear power is so hazardous, so dirty, so unpopular, why is it that even countries with democratic governments are pursuing this so avidly?
Yeah, this is a $1 million question. I think it's to answer that, I think you have to understand that countries are not unitary objects. There are different people involved, there are different groups involved, and some of the costs, many of the risks and so on are very unequally borne. The primary risk of having a nuclear power plant, an accident from a nuclear power plant, is very local. Even though some amount of radioactivity might escape and might spread all over the world, as in the case of Chernobyl and so on. The primary impact is within tens of kilometers of a nuclear power plant. Whereas for somebody who's sitting in Delhi or in Bombay far away, that's not a big issue. Likewise, I think many of these things are not done on the basis of taxpayer money, not on the basis of private money. And in many countries where nuclear power has been put to the test at the marketplace, even if it is backed up with strong political commitment by the political leadership, it has often failed. This has been the case in the United States. It is proving to be the case right now as we speak in the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. So I think that the places where it can be absorbed through some combination of government largesse and private taxpayer money, public taxpayer money, has been the places where it sort of grows.
And finally, what is your take on Kudankulam? And what would you do if you were in control of the country's decision making? What would you have done, and what would you do now that the protests have erupted?
Yeah. So that's a very big if. Somebody like me would never be at the in the government and be able to in a position of power. But let me try and answer that to the extent that I could. So you said if I were in a position of power right now, as your first position, and so that I take to mean that I couldn't sort of answer something wishful like, well, I will just abandon the project as it is, because that come at a huge political cost. So assuming that particular answer is not open to me, let me try and suggest a few things I think a good responsible government should do in this place. So the argument here is that you already spent 17,000 crores on it, we cannot waste that investment, and so somebody has to bear the risk and so on and so forth. I think that three things should be done. One is that if this plant were to be commissioned, it should be commissioned with complete transparency to the local people, who are the people who are concerned about the safety of it. So I would say that if in order to win their trust, which is completely absent at this point, I would open up the operating records as and when the plant is commissioned, and if at any stage the local population, if they feel uncomfortable about this plant, about how it is operating, and maybe invoking the use of using expert knowledge from other places and so on, feel that this plant is not operating well, then I would commit to having that shut down and those problems rectified. The second I would say is that having learned this lesson from Kudankulam, no more nuclear power plants should be commissioned without the consent of people who live in the neighborhood. So in the case of Jaitapur, for example, where the local population has clearly shown that they are not interested, they do not want this plant there, I would abandon it right away. This is not fair to sort of do that. And finally, to address the fact that many of the people who are opposing this plant are opposing it not just because of fear of radiation or of accidents, but also because it's going to impact their livelihood, the least one can do is to say, well, we will compensate you in case you find, for example, that fish catch are going down, or people are not buying your fish or something like that, to which you have to first start off with some kind of a baseline survey and then make some arrangements for how these people would be compensated in case they're going to be bearing losses. These are, I think, three minimal measures which should be taken short of sort of shutting this down if you're going to go ahead with commissioning it.
One last question I have is to do with this nuclear power plant in New York, Shoreham, which was, I think, abandoned at the last stage.
Yes.
And was then subsequently converted into using gas as a fuel.
Yes.
Now, why was that done, and why wouldn't that be a feasible option here?
It could entirely be a feasible option. I have not really looked into that. So that's one reason I'm not talking about it. That's an excellent question. There have been plants which have been abandoned at various stages after construction, and perhaps the even better example than Shoreham is that of the Kalkar reactor in Germany near the border with Netherlands, which was actually abandoned after the whole plant construction had been done, costing about $5 billion, but before the fuel was loaded into it, and it was subsequently converted into an amusement park. Coming back to the basic question, if you want to say you built this infrastructure, some of it can certainly be salvaged and used for other kinds of power generation. Whether that is a realistic alternative, what are the costs of that? I have not looked into this. I have not seen anybody else look into it, so I cannot say it with any authority what that would be, how much that would cost, how feasible it would be, and what would have to be left out.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.